have a first memory?
A first memory? Yes.
Would you tell me what that is?
The very first thing I remember is seeing my father cleaning out a big space heater in the dining room of the home in which I was born. He had newspaper spread all over the floor, and he was digging inside of the space heater to clean out the soot that had accumulated.
So you had a space heater when you were...
A big space heater, yes.
Did you have a favorite activity?
A favorite activity?
Yes.
Then or now?
Then.
I spent a lot of time reading. Reading was always my favorite.
Did you have any childhood responsibilities?
Oh, yes. By the time I was 8 years old, I had two major responsibilities. Every Saturday morning, I had to take a dust cloth, put furniture polish on it, and wipe down all the doors in our house on both sides. Take out the trash, then go to my parents' store and work in the store and do whatever my father told me to do. Straighten merchandise, wait on customers, take out trash if necessary, deliver packages, just odds and ends.
Did you have a family car?
Did we have a family car?
Yes.
Yes, we had one car. It was a 1939 Chevrolet, which my father called Lizzie.
Your siblings?
Siblings?
Yes.
One. I have a sister who's 2 years older than I am. Your Aunt Betty Ann.
Did you have plumbing in your house?
Did I have what?
Plumbing in your house.
I don't understand the question. Did I have what in my house?
Plumbing.
Oh, plumbing. Yes, we did not have to use the outhouse. We had indoor plumbing.
Your clothes?
Clothes?
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Well, when I was very young, kindergarten, first grade, I wore overalls, black and white striped overalls, made by a company called Oshkosh, O-S-H-K-O-S-H. We used to call them the Oshkosh by Gosh overalls.
it's creative. You're dating?
I didn't start dating until I was about 14, 15 years old, and then only in groups. By the time I was 16 or 17, I could go out on dates by myself, once I was able to drive a car.
Were there military drafts? Did you have a
Oh,
military
yes,
draft?
yes, yes. When I went to college, which would be in 1952, the draft was still in place. Because I was going to college and maintaining my grades, I was given a student deferment called a 2S deferment. In my senior year of undergraduate school, which would be 1951, no, I graduated high school in 52, so it would be 1955. In 1955 or early 1956, I received my notice that I had been drafted into the Army.
Your first car?
My first car?
Yes.
When I was just a few weeks away from graduation from law school in 1959, my father and mother gave me a Chevrolet.
The wars when you were growing up or in your adulthood?
The roads in my hometown were mostly dirt. About 20% of them were paved, but mostly they were dirt roads.
What about any wars during your adulthood?
My adulthood?
Yes.
Well,
or childhood?
Well, understand, I was born in 1934. World War II was in place. That was ended in 1945. Not too long after that came the Korean War, and that's what I was drafted for in 1955. Then after because of my hearing loss, I was declared physically unable to be in the military. It's called a 4F classification. Then after Korea came Vietnam. And after Vietnam came the war in Afghanistan, the Gulf War #1 and the Gulf War #2.
Now, your children.
Oh, I have a lot of children. From my marriage to your mom, Barbara, was your mother, and your Aunt Julie, and your Aunt Laura. And when I married Nana, Helen, I adopted Uncle Mitchell and Aunt Brett. And then later we had Aunt Jennifer, with whom you had dinner tonight.
Your first voting opportunity?
Was when I was 21 years old.
So what year would that be?
Maybe 20.
What year would that be?
When I was 21, that'd be 1955.
What was your first school? Your first school?
My first school?
Yeah. Do you remember that?
My first school was elementary school, well, kindergarten. After kindergarten, there was elementary school in Live Oak, Florida. Then from elementary school, we had what was known as junior high school. You call it middle school now. Then high school, at Swanee High School in Live Oak, after which there was University of Florida for 7 years. Then I graduated, got my law degree. The next school I attended, except for being educated to refresh my memory in law, was when I became a judge and went to the National Judicial College in Reno, Nevada, in conjunction with the University of Nevada, and I obtained my Master of Judicial Studies degree.
The house where you grew up what was it, or was it big?
My school?
The house.
The house that I was born in, when I was a little boy, looked real big, but when I was an adult and went back and visited, I realized how small it was. But it had the house I was born in and lived in until I was 9 years old. Between 8 and 9 years old. Had 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, and a front and back porch.
Your first job?
Incidentally, that house was built by my father's father. What else?
What was your first job?
The very, very first job I had was when I was, other than working for my parents, was when I was a sophomore in undergraduate school, and I was a waiter in a sorority house for 1.5 years.
Now, did your parents pay you for working for them?
No.
Did you have electricity in your house?
Yes.
What did you do for recreation?
Well, before, and then I'm thinking, that's why I used the word well. Before I went to the first grade, I would just play with my next door neighbor next to the house in which I was born. When I got into elementary school, and before I was eligible to participate in school athletics or school band, most of my free time was spent working. I joined the Cub Scouts, worked my way up to whatever the highest rank was in Cub Scouts at that time. I want to say way below, but I'm not sure.
Way below.
Then I became a scout when I was 12, and never did make it better than tenderfoot. Stayed in scouting and regular scouting, then later, about the time I was 15, I became a Sea Scout. At the same time, I participated in the Civil Air Patrol. If I wasn't involved in any of those things or in a school-sanctioned athletic activity, I worked in my parents' store.
Did you have a post-secondary education?
Yes. University of Florida for Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, 1956. Doctor of Jurisprudence, University of Florida Law School, 1959. Master of Judicial Studies, University of Nevada and the National Judicial System in Reno, I think it was 1992 or 93. Maybe a little later, I'm not sure of the date.
When was your marriage proposal?
Say again?
Marriage proposal?
Where was my marriage proposal?
And when? Stuff
To
like that.
your mom. I proposed to her at the University of Florida. Let me think where. I know the night I asked her to go steady with me, and I gave her the pendant that I won for oratorical ability when I graduated high school. It was given to me by the American Legion, and then I later gave it to your mom, and it was the October the 19th of 1954. 55. It happened to be the same night that your cousin Pam was born. We had gone to a dinner with a conference of Christians and Jews, and that night I asked her if she would go steady with me. She said yes, and I gave her this pendant. Later that year, Christmas time, I gave her my fraternity pin. And then still later, in 1955, she was unable to come back to University of Florida to go to college. I was in my senior year, and I gave her the engagement ring.
When was that? When was that?
I gave her the engagement ring in 1955, Christmas of 1955. Christmas vacation.
What was your career choice?
I always wanted to be a lawyer. From the time I was 16 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. It was only a question of what kind of law would I practice. By the time I graduated high school, which was when I was 18, I had decided to become a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights litigator.
Who were your great-grandparents?
My great-grandparents I never knew. I know the name of my great-grandfather. His Hebrew name was Yoel, Y-O-E-L, translates into Joel. He was from the Baltic Sea section of Russia. My grandfather was Jacob Fleet, and his wife, my grandmother, was Sarah Frances Fleet. That's on my daddy's side. Now, on my mother's side, I don't know my great-grandparents from my mother's side, but my grandparent was Shanapaya and Herschel Wilson.
Did you have any academic achievements?
In high school, I did pretty well. I made the honor roll and the whole thing for graduation from high school. In college, it was a different story until I took my master's degree in undergraduate and in law school. I had a tough time with my grades, and at one point I was on academic probation. However, when I decided to study for my master's degree, when I had already become a judge, I made straight A's.
I think that's it.
It was a pleasure speaking with you. There's a lot more to the history of our family if you're ever interested.
There's
Do you have more questions? Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Report.
What else?
This is
would you
gonna
like?
be the tell me about one. I'm going to ask you questions about if you remember when something happened, and if you could tell us about that.
Okay. Incidentally, I have a scrapbook here that if you want to look through, it'll tell you an awful lot about the work I did on the bench.
I think that'll help.
Just saving.
It would take you about 2 weeks, 3 hours a day minimum going through all the material that I have from when I was on the bench.
Wow.
Okay, now what is this part? Tell me about one. I will do my best to keep up.
Okay. Do you remember when the stock market crashed?
I wasn't born then. You talked about the Big Depression.
Yes.
That was in the 1920s. I wasn't born until 1934.
Okay.
I read a lot about it.
When Hitler came into power in Germany?
I became aware of Hitler in 1940 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And I heard President Roosevelt, a radio broadcast of President Roosevelt speaking to Congress, and then I started reading about the war.
Do you remember when FDR died?
Yes, vividly.
Do you know what you were doing, or do you not remember?
No, I don't remember that day. I remember the fact of his death, that it happened in Warm Springs, Georgia. It happened when he was in the presence of his secretary. He was in the house in Warm Springs, Georgia, the only house he ever owned. And that's the house he was in when he had the stroke.
Do you remember when D-Day occurred?
D-Day, I remember precisely where I was when the Germans surrendered. I was in Savannah, Georgia, walking home to my maternal grandparents' home, standing in front of a fire station. And the fire truck was out on the sidewalk blowing the siren. I got scared. And I asked the fireman what was wrong. And he said, the war with Japan is over. I do remember D-Day, because I read a lot about that.
When the Korean War occurred?
Yes.
You remember that?
Absolutely. That's when I was drafted.
Did you have any thoughts on the Korean War? Were you against it?
I was concerned about the Korean War because the United States military wasn't properly equipped for the horrendous winters that occur in Korea. There was a lot of publicity about that. I also remember General MacArthur was reactivated in order to respond to the influx of the North Korea. The Chinese had not yet joined the invasion into South Korea when MacArthur was reactivated.
Do you remember when Eisenhower was elected?
Very much so. He beat Adlai Stevenson, the man whom I favored. I was painting the cinder block on the back porch of my parents' home, listening to the election results. And that's when Eisenhower won.
When the first colored television show came out?
I remember when color TV came out, but I don't remember the first time I saw a color TV show.
When Nixon and Kennedy were debating? Do you remember
What
that?
about that?
Just
Oh, the
tell
debate?
Tell us about it?
Yes, I watched the debate. And my reaction was that President Nixon was extremely nervous and upset and was not as well informed as President Kennedy.
Can you tell me about when Sputnik was launched?
That was an awesome event. Really awesome.
Even
I
today?
don't remember exactly where I was, but I remember my first reaction was, holy cow. That's the first thing I said. I'll never forget that.
The first American launched into space?
First American, that would be Neil Armstrong.
No.
Oh, was that Alan Shepard?
Alan Shepard.
Alan Shepard. I met him. I later met him in Vero Beach.
Wow.
I was very impressed. I watched the television program that showed it, the rocket going off, and then when it was coming down on a parachute.
The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred.
Oh, yes. I was living in Hollywood, Florida at the time, and I remember seeing the trains come through Hollywood heading for Key West, filled with military men. And that was exactly what I saw during World War II, whenever the trains, that all of the trains, almost all of the trains, had been confiscated by the federal government to move military troops and supplies around the country. And I remember I was sitting in my car, waiting for the train to go by when I realized that it was full of military men. And I got out of my car on Hollywood Boulevard and saluted. And I had tears in my eyes.
When JFK was assassinated?
Yes, I was trying a case. In fact, I even remember the judge, the late Otis Barrington. It was a case involving a person who had rented a horse and the saddle wasn't put on properly, fell off the horse and got hurt real bad.
What is this? I'm sorry, I can't keep up.
When JFK was assassinated.
Okay.
I was in conference with Judge Barrington, and the other lawyer decided on the jury instructions, November the 22nd. And the judge's secretary opened the door and said, the president has been shot. We immediately locked up all the judges in the courthouse, locked up all the juries, turned off all the radios, and prevented them from hearing anything until they finished their deliberations on whatever case they were dealing with.
When the British rock hit the U.S.
Can't understand.
The British rock hit the U.S., like the Beatles or...
Oh, I could never understand the words the Beatles were saying. They didn't speak clearly enough, so I just didn't bother listening to them. I have later read their lyrics, and they were very, very popular. I saw them for the first time on the Ed Sullivan variety show. They were just a bunch of noise to me. They were not music.
That's what parents say today as well. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated?
I remember that clearly. My reaction, JFK, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. were all assassinated in close proximity in time. And as I heard about each assassination, my reaction, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King, was what's happening to my country. When JFK was killed, I saw on your mom and I had just a black and white television, and the man who did the shooting, Oswald, had been arrested. They were showing pictures of Oswald on the TV, and my mom and I and Aunt Laura, who was just a baby, were just leaving our house in Hollywood to drive to Coral Springs to visit your great-grandparent, Frank and Rose Sokolow. As we walked out the door, I commented to my mom that the police better take good care of this man, Oswald. By the time we got to Frank and Rose Sokolow's house, my mother and father-in-law, Jack Ruby had shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And I was very upset about that. I was also upset about the man who became his lawyer.
Well, the next question was about Martin Luther King.
Well, when Martin Luther King was shot, I was extremely distressed. I was a firm believer in the principles which Martin Luther King was trying to establish throughout the United States, specifically the equality of all people regardless of the color of their skin. To me, for Martin Luther King to have been assassinated was a tremendous loss to the United States. I wasn't sure that there would be someone to carry on his fight for equality. Fortunately, there was. There were a lot of people who carried on the march.
When the first man walked on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
I was watching television. Walter Cronkite was the newscaster whom I was watching when when the astronaut stepped out of the spaceship and said, "One small step for man, one giant step for mankind." Walter Cronkite, for the only time in his life, was speechless. He took off his glasses, put him down on a table and shook his head, and he just couldn't speak. There were tears in his eyes. And I was absolutely stunned. And I was proud. I was proud to be an American.
When President Nixon was elected,
Yes.
could you tell me about
I was
that?
terribly distressed. I had already read about President Nixon. He had been closely allied with Senator McCarthy. I didn't trust the man from what I read about him. I was very upset that he won, and I was convinced that the election of President Nixon would be a disaster for the United States.
When the Vietnam War ended, tell me about that.
I was very frustrated and sad. With all those Americans and other Allied soldiers had died, they had been treated very cruelly by the Vietnamese captors, as was shown by Senator John McCain of today, and other veterans of Vietnam whom I have met. The American public did not support the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, and in fact they, for many years, insulted them and emotionally abused them. My personal feeling was I didn't agree with the manner in which the war had been fought. The French had already been defeated by the North Vietnamese. And one of the main reasons the French and the Americans were defeated is they fought the war on a political basis. And you cannot change somebody's mind politically simply by shooting at them and killing all their friends and neighbors and family. That doesn't solve anything. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and now Vietnamese period, totally dedicated to the proposition of the sovereignty of their country. It's ironic that in spite of all those people who died, Vietnam and the United States are very closely allied for economic purposes. Elizabeth, you can pick up pants and clothing in almost any store, and on a label on the inside it'll say made in Vietnam.
Now, about Nixon, the Watergate, when Watergate occurred.
I wasn't surprised that President Nixon was deeply involved in it. It was a very amateurish burglary at the Watergate that set off everything. In fact, I had hoped that I would be called on to defend one or more of the persons involved, but a lawyer from Miami got in there first. He was later booted aside. I had already had difficulties with President Nixon, and I was not at all surprised that he would engage in the kind of activities that later came to light.
When Nixon resigned, were you surprised at all? Were you?
When what?
When President Nixon resigned.
When he resigned, I had two very distinct feelings. One was he needed to resign, or he was going to be convicted on the impeachment. Understand, impeachment means accused. Impeachment comes from the House of Representatives, who listen to evidence and return what is known as a bill of impeachment, just like they would adopt the law. The trial on the bill of impeachment is conducted in the Senate. Nixon and his advisors realized that Nixon, did not have sufficient political support to defeat conviction on the bill of impeachment if it went to the Senate. Therefore, he resigned. What made me proud was that it was a severe constitutional crisis, and our country survived. Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford became president. There was an orderly transition of power. To keep that in perspective, remember that when Nixon was elected, his vice president resigned a few months later and was convicted in Maryland of criminal activity. Gerald Ford was selected to be vice president. Then Nixon had to resign because of his criminal activity. Gerald Ford became president. And a man by the name of Rockefeller became vice president and presided over the Senate. Rockefeller had wanted to be president, couldn't get enough votes to do it, but this unfortunate series of events occurred. The crisis, constitutional crisis, proved to the world the wisdom of those persons who, from the Continental Congress, devised the scheme, what we call our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Understand that everything that happened with Nixon, Ford, and Rockefeller was determined by the formula of the Constitution, which was adopted before the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was adopted. So the brilliance of those men in the 1700s to create a solution for a problem that they could not have imagined. And 200 years later, or whatever it was, the Constitution worked.
Incredible.
It is incredible.
When Hinckley shot Reagan.
When Hinckley shot Reagan?
Yes.
What about it? What was my reaction?
Yeah. Do you remember where were you, kind of thing?
I don't remember where I was. I do remember saying Hinckley had to be crazy, as opposed to saying he was insane. He had to be crazy to do what he did, and the manner in which he did it. And he claimed that he was doing it to impress a movie star, as opposed to being politically opposed to President Nixon. Reagan. Unfortunately, Mr. Brady was seriously injured as opposed to Nixon being injured. Now, an interesting part about the shooting of Nixon, when he was taken to the hospital, he rolled into the area to be prepared for surgery. And he says to the surgeon, "I sure hope you're a Republican." And the surgeon said, "Mr. President, today we are all Republicans."
Wow. Now, on a sadder note, when John Lennon was assassinated,
It didn't impress me much, other than the fact that it's a terrible way, death by violence, particularly with firearms, is a terrible way to resolve a conflict or to impress anyone. I was not a fan of the Beatles. I understood that persons my age and teenagers, young 20s, they were totally enamored by the Beatles. They were totally captivated by them. But the Beatles just didn't touch me emotionally. So my reaction was not that John Lennon was shot, but that a human being incapable of expressing himself otherwise resorted to gun violence.
and when the Challenger exploded,
Oh, I was terribly upset about that. Really, really, really upset. I think that all of the astronauts were and are heroes in this country. It was sad to lose such brilliance, that collection of brilliance. I was proud of the way the United States responded. The country conducted itself in an appropriate fashion of expressing grief, and to a significant extent they expressed a unification. That's a strange thing about the United States. We can fight and bicker amongst ourselves, be angry with each other, but when a national tragedy occurs, we all fall into line and lock arms with one another to face together whatever the tragedy may be.
when the Berlin Wall came down,
Happy, thrilled, absolutely thrilled. Not because President Reagan had said, "Mr. Khrushchev, tear down this wall," but because the people who were trapped behind that wall for the first time since Hitler came to power in the 1930s had the opportunity to have free thought, freedom of expression, free enterprise. They could be happy, healthy human beings, people who were healthy emotionally as well as physically.
no, when SNL first aired, or
What?
when SNL, Saturday Night Live,
Yes.
first appeared, were you?
I thought it was a wonderful program, and I've not yet seen the quality of people again to replace the original group of people who formed Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
You had absolutely brilliant people such as John Belushi. Unfortunately, he was addicted to narcotics and lost his life. But his capability of bringing laughter to other people without insulting them was important to me.
When the U.S. was attacked on 9/11.
What?
On 9/11, when the U.S. was attacked in 2001.
Ironically, or interestingly, I was at a judicial conference over in the Tampa area, Tampa-St. Petersburg area. I was with about 20 other judges in a particular class designed to teach us how to deal with the stress of being a judge. It is a very stressful occupation. One of the staff members who had organized the conference came into our room right after each judge had been asked, what is the most stressful thing that happens to you and how do you handle it? The staff member said that terrorists had struck the tower, the first tower in New York. One of the judges says, if this is a test question, it's in very poor taste. Staff member said, no, this is the truth. And we broke up the class. I walked out into the lobby and was watching a television set, and I saw the second plane hit the tower. I was astounded at the audacity and the futility of what our enemies had done. I didn't know who they were at the time. I just knew they were enemies of the United States. They struck, then when I heard they struck the Pentagon, and I heard about the people on the airplane that crashed in Pennsylvania, in the empty field in Pennsylvania that had been destined for the White House, I thought, there's courage. The last thing that was heard by anybody about that airplane in Pennsylvania was, okay, let's do it. A man had been talking to his wife or a family member on the telephone, and she heard him say the passengers were going to attack the terrorists. They knew they were going to die anyway, and they chose to die by fighting back. And to me, that was remarkable courage. It made me once again feel both sad the event had occurred and proud to be an American because they fought back.
Now, one more thing that I forgot to ask in the beginning. I've heard that the KKK went to your store, your family store. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
Well, I had a personal experience with the Ku Klux Klan, if that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
The Ku Klux Klan was a regular part of the social environment of the town and the county in which I grew up. Many of my classmates, parents, were members, active members of the Ku Klux Klan. Many of my classmates, if not all of them, or 95% of them probably, shared the same bigotry and prejudice philosophy of their parents as exemplified by the Klan. At the end of my junior year, I was 17 years old. I was elected editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. In the summer break between my junior year and the commencement of my senior year, this would be 1951, my parents had gone on vacation for a week. I was in charge of the store. A person I later learned was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, was also a customer of my parents' store, and he came into my father's store for the purpose of ascertaining what was the status of his charge account, because he owed money, he had bought merchandise, he paid a little bit down, he could buy more merchandise. Today you know it as a credit card. At that time my father called it revolving credit. So this man was questioning how much he had paid and what was his balance due. At the same time that he's looking at that sheet of paper, and while he's examining it, we're not exchanging any words, or there's no conversation, he's just looking at the paper. The African-American man who worked for my parents as both a porter and a salesman, he was restricted by Jim Crow laws and the social environment at the time to wait only on African-American customers. He had sold a pair of overalls to an African-American lady. She wanted to pay for them. If my memory serves me correctly, the overalls or the items she bought was $4.95. And she gave the porter, the salesman, the black salesman, a $5 bill. To reach the cash register, I had to take just 3 steps from where I was with this white man who was looking at his account. And I walked over to the cash register, made the change, and gave the nickel back to the lady, and the white man literally exploded with anger, complaining in some very derogatory words, some very mean words, nasty words. His thoughts about me interrupting my work with a white man and doing something for a black person. When he left the store a few minutes later, I was very angry about what had happened. And I wrote an editorial, what would be my first editorial, only 3 paragraphs long. And in that editorial, and I have a copy of it in my personal papers, the crucial line was that racial prejudice is a cancer in society which must be excised. And this paper will seek out prejudice and expose it wherever it may be found, and fight it where it may be found, or words to that effect. But essentially I said racial prejudice was a cancer that had to be excised. I showed the article to my faculty advisor. She approved it. It was given to the local newspaper who printed our school newspaper for us, and they printed the editorial. The editorial was published on a Tuesday. The following Thursday, a copy of that editorial, word for word, had been printed in red on a white sheet of paper. At the top of this 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper was a call by the Klan for every red-blooded white citizen in Suwannee County to be at a special school board meeting on Saturday, because we can't let this go on, we can't let this exist. And they mentioned me by name, that I had written that article, and that it was wrong, and the school board had to do something about it. And then beneath their article, their comment, the editorial was printed. The school board met on Saturday. There were so many people there in the room for the school board that they had to move it from the school board office to the county courthouse. And at the county courthouse, the ground floor was filled with white people, and the balcony was filled with African American people. If you've ever seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird,
I was just
that's
thinking
exactly
about that.
what it was at this time. My father addressed the school board in terms of he had grown up with all these men. They knew him, and how could they attack his son? And he said some other things. After a whole bunch of discussion, one of the members of the school board said, "Let's hear from the boy," meaning me. And he said he must be a member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I wasn't. I'm sorry I wasn't, but I wasn't. And I'm only 17 years old when this happened. I listened to what they had to say, and they asked me, and they said they wanted to talk to me, and I'm standing in the back of the courtroom. I hadn't been invited to be up front where the grown-ups were meeting. After all, I was just a kid, they said. And I said, I might just as well quit. Nobody supports it. Messing up the football team. So I just quit. I wrote it myself on my own typewriter. I'm not a member of NAACP. And I just quit. It was quit before you get fired. That's what it amounted to. I'm not going to let you fire me. I quit. So